welcome everyone. Porsche, and I'm going to talk about what happened. As we all know, Magnus quit the event as contrary to what we heard. We don't really know what happened, but there were people and others kind of pointing at what direction and claiming that there could be suspicions of Magnus for Game 3, where he played Hans Niemann. What is happening there is actually not that clear, and that is what we know. So, bottom line, so far, only we know that Magnus quit. Magnus did not continue the tournament after his loss against Hans Niemann. He got forfeited in round 4. 10-minute waiting time for him to show up to the game against Mamedyarov, but he didn't show. He didn't show up, which meant he forfeited, and that has consequences. So before the round, Hans Niemann was leading with 3 points out of 4. With this one, he's going to lose this win. Every game that Magnus played is going to be annulled. So his win against Nepo isn't going to be on the cross table, so it doesn't really count. Also, in the same way, Hans Niemann's win against Carlsen does not count, that is. So that really kind of points out that Hans is no longer in the lead. In fact, it is Wesley So who is half a point ahead. Now, rating-wise, it counts. So Hans does get the rating. Magnus does get the rating from what was there and what happened. And that is important information. Why? Well, there are multiple speculations that I will want to get into. Apart from explaining what happened, I'm going to go through this game between Hans Niemann and Alireza Firouzja. Now, this is, again, what I really have to emphasize. We do not know what's happening. There are people that hypothesize some things and allude to some things, and it's very much in the news. So if you're listening, this is sort of the theme that everyone is going by. Now, that does not mean it's the truth. We only know one thing. Magnus withdrew. He gave a Mourinho meme saying, if I say something, it will sound really bad. Now you take it as you will. And some people ran with it. That's what we know. That's in the news. They ran with it, and now everyone is a psychology expert and a body language expert. Not saying that there couldn't be something into it, but there are different ways of understanding of what has happened. So, let's start from the beginning, shall we? Because this is pretty important. I agree with myself. All right, so let's go back here. This is, of course, the Hans game against Firouzja. Want to mention a part of the interview. So there's two big interviews that's actually relevant to this question. The one, of course, where he played Magnus Carlsen. When he played Magnus Carlsen, he mentioned that there was a game he followed between Wesley So, like Carlsen Wesley So, and d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, g3. And he said, when in fact it's going to be a completely different move order. So that game actually went knight f3, castles, g3, c5, bishop g2, takes d5, etc, etc, etc. Now, even though this is a different move order, and people are saying, well, this is not exactly what happened, I do have to mention Nigel Short's opinion that it's not a geography class. And also, it's not a geography quiz, to quote him correctly. Now, I also have to pinpoint here whenever you're preparing, it's always a bit about association. So if you see a game where you see a G3 system, that does not necessarily mean that it's going to be exactly that one. And that's not how your files work either. So if you see, oh, this is the game I've seen from Carlson, I'm assuming that this is something he may play, you are going to associate and say, well, what kind of G3 systems are there that I can look for? So I'm going to give you a breakdown, a Grandmasterly breakdown, what you can look for here. So for example, whenever you would say, okay, this is a Tabia, and like, for example, you could expect this system, you could see G3 here. This is the standard way of the Catalan. The most standard way is knight f3, d5, g3, and this could be on the board. Bishop b4, knight c3, and this actually transposes very similar at least. And if castles, there is a line such as bishop g2 takes, a3 takes, and voila, we are here. And there's also another mistake that everyone's making. Everyone's saying, well, we've never seen Magnus Carlsen play this system, which is called the Ragozin, just for you to know in the future. Actually, this has been played by Magnus Carlsen in the Turin Olympiad. And don't forget, that was an important game that Magnus won, where we've seen knight c6 and bishop g5 happening. So this actually happened, but from a different transposition. So whenever people were saying, well, g3 never actually happened, it might be true. It might be true that you could not expect this one exactly. But after transpositions from a different system, well, not this one, but g3, there takes, a3 takes. This actually has happened in his career. So in the database, you could find this. So that's what I'm trying to say here. He may not remember correctly, or it's also possible that, it didn't exist or something, but there was a game and something very similar. And sometimes chess players do think in associations. Take it as you will. Now, back to the main game, e4, meaning the Hans and Firouzja game. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. It's an interesting game already in the sense we don't know what the players knew. But of course, they've seen that Magnus isn't showing up, which of course is putting pressure. And there were different reactions. Most continued to play on, but there were a couple of players who actually ended up to make a quick draw, meaning the game kind of ended quickly with the game sort of fizzling out early on. Between Nepomniachtchi, the recent challenger, who's going to probably play Ding Liren for a title match, or if we're going to have a Magnus return, Magnus versus Nepo. So Magnus actually did not show up, and Nepo and Wesley, so sort of rattled by the situation, decided to call it a day and didn't play the game. So already there are some reverberations and after effects of the withdrawal immediately. Some of them didn't continue in their normal way. Also, Nepo's reaction was very impressive. What Hans did last time with some gestures, and I definitely advise you to take a look on what he did there. Now, but some of them were more diplomatic. I mean, even Nepo was very diplomatic, even though you could sort of have this feeling of discomfort when he was asked that question. Levon was very diplomatic, calling out people not to be too paranoid about it. Wesley was also his usual diplomatic self, although both Nepo and Vesely sort of alluded that this was very uncomfortable for them and they didn't want to do that. The Foolish Ghost, thank you for the follow. So it's super interesting to see and go and in this direction. Now, there are other things that we really have to remember. We've got an idea. We know that Magnus withdrew, but Magnus still didn't state any reasons. We are speculating here. And that's actually what's important. Many are just running with it. Don't forget that they're running with the ball. They're saying, well, it's a guarantee. We know some stuff. We know that there's some online history for Hans. He was let go for 6 months. He couldn't play competitive chess online. And then he was let back in. We don't know anything about anything remotely in over the board chess. So we don't know anything around that. Alright, so let's take a look of this game. So I have knight f6, d3, bishop c5, all very standard main lines. c3, d6. The opening isn't really that much of interest for us. Bishop f1. The knight is coming closer to the center, putting pressure. Very ambitious play by Hans, but that's of course expected from him. Obvious. It's not very usual. Bishop c7, d takes, knight takes e5, bishop f4, takes, d5, bishop e6, and this is where I want to continue from. So e5, knight d7, queen g3, and so as we said, there are multiple theories. Hikaru said before that he didn't understand how Hans used his time. He wasn't really pinpointing this game between Hans and Firouzja, but when he was playing Magnus. Because as we know, Hans said it was a huge miracle that I found out that's going to be the way that Carlsen is going to play. Now, there are many theories. One of the theory is that's kind of rumored is maybe Magnus got hacked. Maybe Magnus' information is out. Now you might be wondering, what's the big deal about getting to know which opening is going to be played? Well, it's a big deal, especially when Magnus is playing, because Magnus doesn't always play the best line. He sometimes semi-bluffs. And when he played that game, and when he went for that line, he kind of bluffed his way. He was bluffing. He was going for something that's not entirely correct. So when Hans actually managed to find that file, or managed to guess it, we don't know which one, that was sort of the end of it. The position was immediately better for him, and he was calling the shots then on. But that is also very interesting, and Hikaru pointed that out, that he was suggesting moves that are very hard to understand, and they're nowhere near possible. So we gotta go here. Just gonna take a look at that one. So g3, no, not that one. Bishop b4, g3, d5, a3, takes, bishop g2, c5, knight f3, castles, c takes, queen takes, knight c6, takes, e5, bishop g5, and h6, rook d1, bishop e6. Now, what is very interesting is that he's suggesting ideas of queen h4, but it never really does work. Always h takes g5, and the game really ends immediately. So that suggestion in the post chat doesn't really make too much sense. Rook d1, bishop e6, and goes on and on. Carlsen was worse. Now, this is my 2 cents from the opening phase, Black didn't play anything outstanding. So once he hit these ideas of going e5, just pushing this pawn, all of these moves are pretty much findable for Black. So it's not at all impossible to find these. Of course, it kind of is strange. These queen h4 moves, it's hard to wrap our brains around. We don't know what that means because we don't see the lines. So we kind of need a backup again from Hans. What does he really mean? Because we don't see where queen h4 works. He was sort of alluding that it works somewhere in his files. And of course, there's a benefit of that. We don't know. And there was another thing that I think people misunderstood, but that's from the Firouzja game. So I'm going to go back there. So let's go back. Bishop f1, c6, knight c4, bishop c7. We looked at this one where he is going after these guys in the center, putting pressure. Take 6, e5, bishop e6, e5, queen g3. Queen g3 is a very logical move. You are going for the attack. Absolutely going for the attack here. h8. Now, Firouzja makes a human decision. And when I was looking at this live, I gotta admit, I also felt that, you want to go king h8. Why? Because if you take, bishop takes h6, this looks extremely scary for Black. g6, and my first reaction was bishop g5, f6, bishop h6, and some dangerous compensation, with Firouzja actually having to go to play something like g5, and the computer says that this position is balanced with very accurate play from both sides. Now, here Hans said f4, and then the attack is big and huge. Well, I don't know what that really means here, because where's the advantage? Where's your full compensation? Now, it's very interesting when he sort of says, well, it's going to prove itself. But mostly it was from the previous one where he said, I've got a +1 advantage and it's going to grow. And so there are different chess players out there. And I gotta say, there are some classical chess players, and there's not so much classical chess players. There is a computer generation. Hans is a computer generation. And I don't mean anything by that. By what I mean computer generation, I mean that he uses computers to prepare. He thinks in computer terms. Sanai, thank you for the follow. So he thinks in computer terms. He's not really focused on anything else there. So he thinks, okay, this position is 1.2, meaning 1 pawn advantage, just to translate it into English from computer. But that doesn't mean that's necessarily wrong. You can think that way. It's okay to have a thought process of that. I think, okay, the computer would think it's 1, and then it will grow and it will understand. Like, you sometimes have to wait for depth. Whenever you see chess players ponder, they're basically gaining those depths. So let's say when I tank for an hour, meaning think for an hour, that's like I'm trying to get in the zone to understand the nitty-bitty things in the position and get into deeper depth. So from a shallow observation, I'm going to get on the top of that. So then you'd realize what the situation is. Now, for us, I'm more of a classical player. I would take my time and I would try to figure out what's going on. But for some people, they want to think like a computer. And they often say, many top players say, what would a computer do here? So a lot of times, they're not really trying to figure things out. they assume this is how the computer would think. Julian, thank you for the follow. So it's very interesting. You're not always necessarily going to have the same way of thinking. There are different ways of thinking about chess. However, I do have to admit, whenever he said f4 here, I was like, I don't quite get it. I don't quite understand what's going to be happening afterwards. That didn't really make much sense to me. And also, the computers didn't understand it either. While in the post-mortem with Alejandro Ramirez, and of course, shout out for the St. Louis Chess Club broadcast. They're doing a splendid job. And of course, Alejandro is always spot on with some questions. Now, for some of you are just joining, we're following through. We're looking at the game between Hans and Firouzja. But again, bottom line, we don't know. We're still waiting for Carlsen to tell his reasons why he withdrew. He gave a meme, but we don't know exactly why he did what he did. Now, some people already kind of decided, well, they have a reason, and this is the reason. We don't know if that's the reason, and they're trying to push that narrative. We're going to see, but let's see what happened and what we know so far. So let's continue and finish it up. So King h8, Knight d6. King h8 isn't actually the best move, but a very good practical move from Firouzja. So now you'll see why Firouzja is such a fantastic player. As he said, I was scared, quoting. And yeah, King h8 is a typical grandmasterly move. You're going there and you're not going for the complications that you can't foresee, because it turns out this is playable, but you're shaking in your boots when you have to face this attack. It goes for King h8, says I'm going to go for something that's not as accurate, but is safe. Knight d6, and of course this is an advantage for Hans. This is a better position. Knight c5, and interestingly enough, we jump there. Knight d6. In the calculation, g5, h4, and he only looks at g takes f4, queen takes f4, king g7, and the attack. But then, this line. But here, Peter Swidler, 8 times Russian champion, interjects and says bishop takes d6. What's going on here? Which would mean that black is completely winning in this position. Now, some people kind of take this as a direct proof. It's not a proof. Sometimes people take the critical line and run with it. So yes, this was a faulty analysis. Could mean whatever it means, but whenever you're trying to prove what's the solution, you always look at the critical line. So you don't go, well, what if black plays something random, moves the rook somewhere? No grandmaster ever looks at a side move. And sometimes you have a move that's outside your vision. So it's very natural to actually look at this one, takes, and then try to prove that you have an attack. And sometimes it does fall out of your vision that bishop takes d6 is there. Of course, you decide what you think about it, but it's there. That's how most grandmasters think. They think there is a critical line that needs the burden of proof. So that's why he'd look at g5 there. So knight c5 was played. Instead, rook d4, takes, knight e4, takes, rook takes, queen f6, bishop d3. And he was saying that bishop e3 would give him an advantage, and that is true. White does have a very strong pawn on d6 and a bishop pair. Plays bishop d3, bishop f5, rook e3, and there's a great point here by Firouzja. Bishop e5, queen g5, rook g4. Beautiful, beautiful position. But what's even more beautiful is this line that Firouzja was giving. Bishop takes g4, f4. The queen is under attack. The whole G file is in a shish kebab, and after queen h5, hg, and the bishops are absolutely destroying the black's position, and the queen on h5 is completely trapped. You can't do anything. You can shake hands and go home. The beautiful, beautiful line. However, luckily for Firouzja, there is queen c1 check here. Takes, and queen g5 back. Queen d4, f5, f4, and it turns out that this position is very tall, like there's compensation, so many things can happen. It's very much playable, it's very scary for black. I would take white here, even though it looks tricky. He goes for rook e3, and now his position is slowly deteriorating. Takes queen e5, queen f5, queen e3. It was very interesting because what he said, what Hans said, that you actually, like Alejandro said, my bad. Alejandro actually said that, okay, so then you were holding the position. And Hans took offense to that. He said, well, I never really was in danger. Which is, of course, interesting. Where in reality, he was a slight bit worse and had to be accurate. He was sort of in the back foot towards the end there. Rook e8, queen d2, rook d8, bishop e3, c5. And we're just going through and breezing through the motions. These are not the interesting part for us. Queen c6, rook e3 takes, rook takes c7, and Firouzja equalizes, and the game ends in a perpetual. So this is what we know so far. Really hope you guys actually enjoyed what I gave here. I will talk more about it later on. So, stick around in the future. You're over here and over here if you're interested. So there are some of these. There were also some power struggles in the interview. A lot of times Alejandro would suggest a move, and if it would fit Hans, Hans would say, well, of course, of course, of course. If not, if it would disagree, he would take offense to that. So it's very interesting how there was always like a bit of power struggle there. Now, as we said, none of this really means a whole lot. There is, of course, evidence or reasons we are waiting for. This is just one part of the story. This is what we've heard from one party of people on the internet. They claim that, oh, this could be the only reason. This could be the only reason out there possible for what happened. We don't know what happened. We are not at all sure what happened here. We might see what Magnus has to say, but these are what we know so far. Thank you for watching.